And I can't think of a better way to start this meeting than with our keynote speaker, Dr. Cristián Samper. Cristián joined the Wildlife Conservation Society in 2012 as president and CEO. Most recently, he was with Smithsonian, where he was responsible for all of the museums and research facilities within the Smithsonian in the areas of science, history, arts, and culture. He now, of course, oversees 5 AZA-accredited institutions, including the New York Aquarium, which under his leadership is undergoing a complete transformation following the tragic destruction from Hurricane Sandy. And of course, he leads one of the world's largest and most preeminent conservation organizations, which works to save species in over 60 countries and in all of the world's oceans. But also importantly, especially to this group, under Cristián's leadership, WCS is forging partnerships with zoos and aquariums, certainly within the United States, but also around the world to address a range of conservation issues, from including elephant poaching and all illegal wildlife trade. So I've had the opportunity this year to spend some time with Cristián, and including meeting with both he and his team to talk about how we all can work together to save animals from extinction. And our first really long conversation was actually at their annual gala. And it was a wonderful conversation, but I have to say that although I was definitely engaged, I was also a little bit overcome with being starstruck by the fact that I got to meet their honorees, who are Hillary and Chelsea Clinton. But nonetheless, it was a great conversation. So I knew that I would find Cristián both brilliant and charming. I also knew that I would see in him a very strong vision for conservation. All of that is and is true. But I was especially impressed by 2 things with Cristián. One was clearly his very deep feeling, his very heartfelt caring for the state of the planet and for the animals on the planet. And the other was that his vision recognizes the importance of AZA as an association and the tremendous power that we all have, that our zoos and aquariums have, to engage people in conservation, and how, oh my goodness, what the enormous potential is if we can all work together. So with that, it is my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Cristián Samper. Please join me in welcoming him. And you are brilliant and charming.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Jackie, for those kind words and for being here. It's great to be here with a number of friends. I look forward to meeting many of you, but to be here in Orlando and to have an opportunity to share with you a little bit of my own history, my views about conservation, and very much about the role that zoos and aquariums have to play in addressing this global challenge and this opportunity. And I want to start this with a story. But it's a story that happened 100 years ago. As a matter of fact, 100 years ago this month. And as Jackie mentioned, before joining WCS, one of my honors was leading the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History for a decade. And there, we had an incredible collection representing about 136 million specimens from all over the world. But a few of those were truly remarkable specimens. And one of those is here on the slide. And this is the passenger pigeon. And the image you see on the right-hand side, that is Martha. She is the last passenger pigeon that was known to live. She died at the Cincinnati Zoo 100 years ago this month. And the Cincinnati Zoo is doing a whole lot of events honoring this species. The one on the right is a male passenger pigeon from that collection. And it is important to put a face to extinction, but what most people don't realize when we talk about the passenger pigeon is that this was probably the most abundant bird species that ever lived. It was well known for its natural history in forming huge flocks that would roam around parts of the US, and some of the historical testimonies from the 19th century talk about these sightings, like this quote, 1866, Southern Ontario. A flock that was 1 mile wide, 300 miles long, and took 14 hours to pass a single point. And these birds were following the mass fruiting trees, and because they were so abundant, you could actually see the abundance. It would show constantly in the headlines of all the local newspapers. And that bird, which was so widespread, that covered all of eastern North America, that undertook these incredible migrations, that was such an abundant species, went extinct 100 years ago. And it went extinct for many reasons that we're still trying to understand. There was incredible hunting. There were barrels full of passenger pigeons that were sent to New York. There was land use change that was happening with the agricultural frontier expansion in the US. There was climate change that was already starting to impact it, and probably disease. But all these things came together to take this one species and the last few specimens that were found in zoos, and yet we as a community, despite our best efforts, failed to actually save the species. But it's not all sad news, because exactly at the same time in the same geography as this story was unfolding, and that's Martha, there was another story that was playing out across North America. And that was the story of the American bison. This other extraordinary animal, millions of them roaming across the plains of North America, an animal, a species that was extraordinarily important for the North American Indians and their livelihoods, but also a species that was hunted and decimated to the brink of extinction, including hunting millions, not just one, but millions of bison across North America. To the point that back around the time of Martha, in the late 1800s, the expeditions that were sent out to try and identify and find the last few bison quite often would come empty-handed. There were no bison to be seen. Fortunately, there were a group of committed conservationists that decided to do something about it. And one of those was a man called William Hornaday, who had been at the Smithsonian National Zoo and was the founder of the New York Zoological Society, who went out there to collect the last few remaining bison to make sure every museum would have a skin. But his experience for 2 years in the West changed his views, and he decided to bring back some bison from the last few remnant populations that were still found in parts of North America, and bring them back to the National Zoo and to the Bronx Zoo, and set up a program that did captive breeding of the American bison. And those bison that were bred there at the Bronx Zoo, at the National Zoo, some of those went back and were reintroduced into some of the parts in the West, including some of the reserves near Yellowstone National Park, which was established 150 years ago next year actually. But it tells us the choices that we make as a society, and how in the same time we made two choices of two extremely abundant species. One went extinct, and the other one's alive, and today there are more than 500,000 bison living across North America in many areas. And some of these animals would not be here without the rule of zoos and aquariums that was done 100 years ago. But the point is that that same story is playing out today. 100 years later, we are making that choice as a society, and it's up to every one of us to make a choice and to help. Whether it's the African elephant, and I'll be talking a lot about that later, but it's not only the big, it's also the small. Like the Kehansi spray toad, which was the first amphibian to go extinct in the wild that was reintroduced thanks to the work of the Toledo Zoo and the Bronx Zoo. But it's not only on land, but it's in water. And the story that's happening today with sharks and rays, what's happened to marine mammals, which are actually coming back from extinction. And let me just take a moment to point out that yesterday, for the first time ever, the new CITES regulations went into place that regulate the trade of 5 species of sharks and rays. And it's the first time in our history that we've actually put in place this. But our work as zoos and aquariums will determine the fate of these species. And that's what I want to address in the talk today. But before I do that, I want to address the broader issue of what's happening between conservation and development, because this is about trade-offs. Then I'll talk about the role of zoos and aquariums, and I want to spend a few minutes talking about elephants as a case study and how we can all work together to make a difference. So this is our planet. This is our little blue marble. This is our planet that's almost 5 billion years old. It's our home. Now we know with the advances of astronomy, there are other planets out there, and probably in our lifetimes, there's a good chance that we will find life somewhere else. But for now, this is our stage. The history of life on this planet has been unfolding for the last 3 billion years, and this is the oldest known fossil from the Burgess Shale in British Columbia. This is 560 million years old. And that was one of the first animals that we know of in the fossil record. And yet many branches and many species have gone extinct. But we still share the planet with many of these species that live in many places. This is one of my favorites, the hermit hummingbirds, which are found in Colombia, which is the country where I grew up and where I started out as a biologist. And many of those specimens are found in the knowledge in collections like this, which is one aisle in one floor at the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian, which has one of the largest collections of butterflies in the world. But the scientific knowledge gathered from all of these specimens is now within our fingertips, and we're at a point where we've integrated knowledge, where it's freely available, and where we're starting to make use of that knowledge to inform conservation choices. Most of the information about life on Earth has been pulled together through a project that we started 7 years ago, which I invite all of you to see, called the Encyclopedia of Life, which has 1.3 million species pages, 46 million pages of literature linked to them, and it's free for anyone, anywhere in the world. Access to all knowledge about all life on Earth is within our fingertips. And we're using that knowledge to try and understand the diversity of life and where it is found. In this case, this is one of the maps looking at the distribution of plant diversity worldwide, based on the work of William Barthelot and Bond. But the fact is, if we want to conserve biodiversity, we need to know where it's found. We need to know the natural history of this biological diversity in many of the animals, and we need to use this to really make choices and inform our conservation efforts. Now, the other big player in the history of this planet is us. And this is one of my favorite landscapes in the world. This is the Roraima Shield in southern Venezuela, and the tepuis, which are these gigantic rock formations. But if you go there and start climbing up these mountains, halfway up those mountains, you run into images like this. These are images and pictograms that were made by our ancestors many thousands of years ago, several thousand years ago. And of course, they are a very powerful reminder that our ancestors and Native Americans and many people all over the world, of course, relied on the use of animals and plants for their livelihoods. And it's not only those, but we were out there hunting and gathering plants and animals. And through the work that we did over time, we came to domesticate a handful of species that have become the foundation for society as we know it through the emergence of agriculture. And thanks to agriculture and thanks to changes that have happened, this has impacted the lives of many people out there, and it resulted in the incredible growth of human population, the urbanization. But the challenges that we face today as a society are bigger than ever. Last year marked for the first time the point when the population of humans on the planet crossed 7 billion people. And more than half of those people live in cities. And those people in cities will often only experience nature through the work of the zoos and the aquariums. I'm going to share with you a few data points of what's happened in the last 20 years. Between 1992 and 2012, or a period of 20 years, the population of people on this planet grew by 1.5 billion people. The total number of people expected to live in the planet by the end of this century will be about 9 billion people. And it's not only more people, it's more people that as we improve standards of living are putting more demands and using more natural resources. During that same period of time, the consumption of meat by those people on average went up from 34 kilograms per person to 43. So we're looking not only at more people, but more people using most resources. We can see here the case for meat and also for seafood, where the global increase went up by 32% in the increase in consumption of seafood on average in the last 20 years. But of course, our human footprint is not homogeneous. We're concentrated in certain parts of the planet. This is a stunning image that was produced by National Geographic last year that combines not only our human footprint, but the level of development and well-being. Those 9 billion people are concentrated largely in parts of Asia. But we look at places like Africa, and Africa alone is estimated to have more than 2 billion people this century. And it is those people and that human footprint and the demands for that food that's starting to really make choices and changes in the landscapes and in the oceans where we live every day. Look at this other image, which is a map showing the agricultural footprint both for crops and livestock. Crops in green and livestock more in the brown color. But this is an image of those parts of the planet where agriculture or agricultural systems and dairy production systems and livestock have fundamentally changed the systems out there, the natural ecosystems. And we can see that this human footprint is encroaching, it's having a big impact out there, and it's impacting many of the people, many of the animals, many of the plants that are found out there. What we have done in order to feed 7 billion people is we have intensified agriculture. We've massively transformed, we've used fertilizers, we've dramatically increased the productivity of food, and that is the good news. As a matter of fact, over the last 20 years, the food production index, a measure of productivity of food, while the world population increased 26%, the global food production grew by 45% globally. That's the good news. The bad news is that that's happened in certain parts of the planet, and there are many communities that are still living in the edge, and we still find many places where people are dying from famine. But this demand cannot stay forever, and we're going to see some of these changes happening going forward. But during that same period of time, we have lost more than 300 million hectares of forest to give way to agricultural production. And one of the big challenges that we need to face as a society is the question of how are we going to feed 9 billion people without expanding the agricultural footprint and without losing the last few remnants and the places that we still have as part of nature. So if we want to really change the future, we need to work with the people doing agriculture, with the people planning cities, with the people really starting to change the world. The projection is this is a map showing the urban centers, the cities worldwide, and every one of those red dots on the map represents a city that's estimated to have more than 10 million people by 2025. Every dot there over in yellow represents a city of more than 1 million people. And in every one of those dots that we see here, there is or should be a zoo, an aquarium, or a botanical garden, which represents an opportunity to connect people with nature. The other thing that's happening in addition to urbanization is that the world is becoming increasingly integrated. This is a map showing the shipping lanes for the transports of goods across the world. What we see is that many of these elements, both minerals, plants, so many things, goods and manufactured goods, are being shipped all over the world, and along with them, many species that are shifting continents, some of which are becoming invaders, in this case, marine invaders. So the fact is, this increasingly global world, we are moving around, and with us, creatures and animals are moving around more and more, for better and for worse. But the other thing that's happening, which we've talked about a lot, but we still need to understand better, is the impacts of global warming and climate change that are happening. Now, this is something that's happened for many times in the history of the planet, but what we know is that the rate of change has increased steadily. Over the last 20 years alone, we see the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere increase by almost 10%, and some of you saw the news that last week, the observations of CO2 levels measured at the top of Mount Mauna Kea in Hawaii recorded the highest level of CO2 in the atmosphere ever measured. So this is playing out as we speak. We know that this is one of the factors that's determining and yielding a warmer planet. And with that, it's changing the composition of many parts. And one of the things we know is that the areas that are biggest hit by this global warming are the northern latitudes. This is one example from NASA and the work of NASA indicating the changes in the temperature, which have been of more than 3 degrees Celsius in the northern latitudes resulting in ice melts and impacting many of the wildlife that are found there. But it's not only the wildlife, it's the people. It's the people and the choices that they're making every day. The recent IPCC report that was released just a couple months ago really gives us the best scientific assessment of what's happening, and we know that many, many communities are having a harder time having access to water. We see that here in North America, the droughts that are happening in many parts of the West and the fires that are happening are fundamentally changing the ways that we're living. But we also know that this is starting to have an impact in the agricultural productivity. And one of the things that was most concerning to me about the recent report of the IPCC is that it's estimated that in the next 20 or 30 years, the agricultural yields of many of the food crops will probably drop between 2 and 4% as a direct result of global change. So this is a real issue, not only impacting the people, the systems that we're doing, our ability to sustain livelihoods, but it's impacting the animals that we have. And some of you saw that just last week, the Audubon Society released a very interesting report. I don't have an image of it, showing the predicted impact of climate change on the distribution of birds of North America. And it found that for more than 300 bird species in North America, the geographic change will shift dramatically over the next 50 years, between now and 2080. And the fact is that we really want to manage biodiversity. We have to manage it in a world that's changing very rapidly. And we need to team up and really figure out how we plan for these changes to make sure that they're done in a way that's compatible with conservation. It's not only happening in lands, it's also happening in the oceans. One of the consequences of increasing CO2 levels is that the ocean is becoming more acidic. And this is a big deal because remember, the oceans are more acidic. It's not only sea level change, it's actually starting to impact the entire food chains of plankton and the livelihoods of many of the animals, the fish and the marine mammals that are found there in these oceans. And this is an example from the most recent IPCC report that just came out, showing a projection of the changes in catch potential of fisheries across the world. And every area you see there in red is an area where it's estimated that the marine fisheries catch, will decrease directly as a result of the climate change impacts. The world is changing. The world is changing very fast. And the question is, how are we going to adapt to this change, and what can we do to help address this? But to do this, we have to really understand the various drivers of change, whether it's overexploitation, or climate change, or invasive species, or pollution. And we need to understand how those various drivers are impacting and playing out in the different places where we work. The good news is that we have many response options in our hands. We live in a time where technology has taken us to whole new frontiers. We can now look out from space and start understanding this planet and look at how it's changing day by day. We live in a time when not only do we have incredible information about the planet, but it's widely available through the explosion in information technology. We live in a time when genetic engineering and molecular genetics are beginning to transform our daily lives, whether it's human medicine, agriculture production, or the use of synthetic biology for potentially breeding or dealing with things like the extinction. And we also have new sources of power, renewables, that are starting to address and to change, fundamentally change where we get our power from, reducing and beginning to tackle the issues related to climate change. And we're beginning to adapt in these cities where we live, and we see that there are new practices being done, like green buildings. We're also making choices as a society in the products that we buy. And it's great to see the growth in products like the Forest Stewardship Council wood products, zero deforestation soy, many other products that are starting to empower consumers to make choices every day about what we do and how it can have an impact in the future of these landscapes and the planet. And also, there's political will. And we've been very pleased to see 20 years ago, the governments of the world came together, adopted the Convention on Biological Diversity, and just a few years ago, they came together and adopted a roadmap between now and 2020 called the Aichi Targets, which is a roadmap showcasing how more than 180 nations across the world can work together to address many of the challenges and take advantage of the opportunities that we have. And one of those challenges that I want to highlight today relates to the declaration and management of protected areas. Because so much of conservation is about making choices. It's looking about conservation versus transformation. The good news is that globally, we've seen a dramatic increase in the areas that are set aside for conservation worldwide, in both the land and the sea. And now what we have to do is make sure that they're well designed in this changing world that will be viable in the view of climate change and that we can manage them effectively. But this is the choice that we need to make. This is one of my favorite images from a project we worked on at WCS called Manhattan, of Manhattan now and 400 years ago. This same story is happening in every one of your towns and cities. It's happening here in Orlando. It's happening everywhere. And it is the question about how this human footprint is going to change and how we can play out and how we can take advantage of the biggest challenges and opportunities. To summarize this part of the talk, I'd say we have never had more knowledge about life on Earth than we have right now, and we have never had more information about this than we have now. Yes, there are going to be many more people, and they're going to be demanding more food, but we can be smarter about the way we produce it, where we produce it, and doing it in a way that won't increase the footprint. Cities are both a threat and an opportunity, but we're seeing in many places having more people in cities is starting to reduce the footprint in some of these landscapes. And globalization can also empower us to move some of these goods and set aside some areas for conservation. Climate change is a big element that we have to deal with and adapt, but the new technologies are going to allow us to respond to many of the changes that are going on. But there is one more thing that I think will fundamentally change the way that the world will develop and the choices that we as a society will make in the next few years. And that is everyone in this room and the work that we all do. Because zoos and aquariums offer a window into that world. For many of the people that will live in these cities like New York, but every one of the cities where you live, this may be the only opportunity to connect with some of these animals from Madagascar or other corners of the world. And it's the opportunity to inspire and to open the minds and reach the hearts of the people that are visiting every one of us. And it is the opportunity to really change the world. So the key point is zoo and aquariums play a key role in shaping the future of this planet. And we do it in two fundamental ways. First is the public awareness and engagement. How do we reach those 180 million visitors that we have across AZA institutions, or the 700 million visitors that we have across zoos and aquariums worldwide? That is extraordinarily important if we have the right message and we really empower people to make choices well. But the other part of the equation is really not only dealing with the species that we have in our zoos and aquariums, but doing this work in field and in field conservation. Now today, for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on field conservation for the rest of this talk, but I don't want to lose sight of our importance of connecting the field conservation with our facilities. Now the good news is many zoos and aquariums, and all of you here, are working on this already. I just picked a few examples from AZA different projects, whether it's working Grevy's zebra by the St. Louis Zoo in northern Kenya, or working in endangered birds of Hawaii, where the vast majority of species of birds have gone extinct, but the San Diego Zoo has been doing some incredible work with captive breeding there. Or closer to home, the work that the Brevard Zoo is doing on the Perdido Key beach mouse. It's a cute mouse, I'll grant you that. Or, as was just mentioned, the work that Walt Disney has been doing related to marine and sea turtle conservation. Or whether it's the work that the Woodland Park Zoo is doing on freshwater turtles. Or the work that the Lincoln Park Zoo is doing in the Serengeti. Or the partnership between many of the zoos that have pandas doing in the field, including National Zoo, Zoo Atlanta, Memphis, really focusing on conservation of pandas out there in the wild. Or right here, closer to home, looking at the work in pygmy rabbits that's being done by the Oregon Zoo and the Northwest Trek Wildlife Park. And I could give you many more examples, including, of course, sea otters and the work that Monterey Bay Aquarium has been doing, or the work that's been doing prairie chickens by the Houston Zoo. All in all, the good news is that the zoo and aquarium, the AZA members, have more than almost 3,000 conservation projects that are happening right now as we speak. And they take place in 127 countries, and every one of them is starting to make a difference. Together, we as a community are investing $160 million a year in field conservation. That is larger than the budget of most of the other conservation groups in this country and makes AZA one of the largest investors in field conservation in the planet. That's the good news. But the challenge is that we could all do more. On average, about 2.7% of the revenues from the AZA members, based on the latest survey, are being invested in field conservation. I think we all need to move that. We really need to move it and make sure that we invest more, not only in our parks, but in the field. If you look at those 3,000 conservation projects and where they're found, this is based, again, on the latest survey by AZA. About half of those field conservation projects are happening here in North America. About 23% in Africa, 19% in Asia, 9% in South America, and 1% in Oceania. If you look at the distribution of those projects taxonomically, almost half of them are focusing on mammals. Understandably so, because we have so many mammals in our collections. About 20% of them birds, 13% of reptiles, and about 9% of fish. But if you look at the number of projects by taxa, the interesting thing is, of the top 10 species by number of conservation projects across AZA members, all the top 10 are mammals. That's good, but the challenge that we have is that we cross-reference this with which are the animals that are in danger of extinction out there based on the IUCN surveys and the red lists. We find that the most endangered groups of animals out there are turtles, 51%, or primates, 48%, amphibians, 41%, mammals, 25%, or birds, 13%. So I think part of the question that we need to ask ourselves is, are we doing the investments in the right species? And it can not only be about the species that we have, but the species that need it the most. And making that connection between those two is part of the challenge that we, as members of AZA, have going forward. The other thing that we have learned is that doing conservation requires a whole ecosystem approach. It's really focusing not only on the species, but where it lives, and all of the changes and the threats and the issues that are going on out there. And I want to move into the last part of this talk with a personal journey that happened just last week. I took this picture last week in a place called Niassa in northern Mozambique. It's an extraordinary landscape. It is an area, it's a reserve, it's a protected area that is 4 times the size of Yellowstone. It's bigger than the state of Tennessee. This is one place where we started working a couple years ago, along with other partners, and there are other groups like the Houston Zoo that have been supporting some of the work there. But it's an extraordinarily important place for conservation. It's a stunning landscape with these Miombo woodlands, the typical East prairies, but one difference is these gigantic rock formations called Inselbergs, which are found there. Niassa happens to be one of the most important places for carnivores in all of Africa. As a matter of fact, it contains the largest population of painted dogs or wild dogs in Africa today. It also has big populations of lions and many other carnivores. And the good news is populations of lions, based on work of people like Colleen Begg and others, have been increasing in the last decade. It also happens to be one of the largest populations of elephants found in East Africa. These are these incredible Inselbergs or rock formations that are found there. But it turns out that there are more than 12,000 elephants living in Niassa Reserve today. The problem and the challenge is that we're also losing them. I took this picture last week. This year alone, more than 500 elephants have been killed in Niassa Reserve. And the number of elephants is probably about half of the original number that were found in the reserve. And you know, I've been working in this for many years, and the last couple of years I've spent a lot of time, along with Dan Ash and others, focusing on the issue of ivory. But one thing is to read the reports, One thing is to see the PowerPoints. One thing is to see the images. But for me personally, what was really hard was to actually go there in the field and see it firsthand. This picture was taken 5 days ago. This elephant, a bull probably about 15 years old, was killed by poachers in Mozambique last week. And because of the patrols and the measures that were being taken, the poachers escaped and fled before taking the ivory. But this story is happening now, every day. We're losing one elephant every 15 minutes, 96 elephants a day, 35,000 elephants a year. And they're all being killed for their ivory. And this ivory is ending up in the streets of New York, and Florida, and in China. But we're tackling this. This means not only protecting the elephants there, but dealing with organized crime. Last week, this photo was also taken last week in the AZA Reserve, working with the Mozambique government, the rangers, and others. We managed to arrest a group of 6 poachers that were the ones killing elephants like the one we just saw. And by dismantling each of these groups and dismantling the trade chains of ivory that lead all the way to China, we're starting to deal with this issue. But the story of African elephants, which I want to use as an example today of how we can work together, is really tragic. In 1980, there were about 1.2 million African elephants left. I should mention, of course, they're Asian elephants, and those populations until now are relatively stable. But in 2012, there were 420,000 elephants. That's less. We have lost 2/3 of all of the elephants in Africa in the last 30 years. And in a survey that we did, working with a number of partners and led by WCS, of the African forest elephant, which is a different species, and it's the one you see there in the picture, in the Congo Basin, the rainforest of the Congo Basin, we found that we lost 76% of the African forest elephants in the last 10 years. This is serious. We're losing this war, and we cannot stand by as a community and let it happen, and we will not let elephants be the passenger pigeon. The good news is there are many places where there's still extraordinary elephant populations. And we know if we focus on it, we can secure those populations. And if we secure them, we know the populations increase. This is one of our study sites in northern Tanzania, an area called Tarangire, where Charles Foley has been doing a lot of work studying these elephants for the last 20 years. And by focusing on it, by developing tourism, we know that the elephant populations here have increased by 5% per year for the last 20 years. And this has been done, by the way, with the support of many of the zoos that are here. Every one of these zoos listed on the slide has been supporting the work that's being done in Tarangire Reserve. And what we need to do is take that example and scale it and take it across Africa and work with other groups. But what we have developed is a 3-pronged strategy to deal with this crisis. We need to stop the killing, we need to stop the trafficking, and we need to stop the demand for ivory. Starts with stopping the killing. We know where the elephant populations are, and we know what proportion of them are dying right now from their killing. What we need to do is make sure that every one of the key elephant populations is secure, and that requires investing in law enforcement and really putting the resources and training on the ground to be able to deal with this crisis. We know, based on field surveys, that when we invest, we will turn these data around. In this case, the data showing some of the protected areas in Central Africa and some of the areas where we've managed to reverse this if we have enough people trained doing the protection. But of course, these elephants are dying because of the trade. And it's trade that's going mostly to Asia, but not only to Asia. As a matter of fact, the United States is probably the 3rd biggest consumer of ivory in the world right now. Much smaller than China, smaller than Thailand, but we're demanding ivory right here. What we need to do is stop the trafficking. We need to tackle the work there. And we're doing this by simple things like introducing sniffer dogs that can really start to tackle and to break the chains of trade of ivory. And last year reported the largest number of seizures of ivory going from Africa to Asia ever. And that's just one step how we're starting to break this and dismantle the organized crime that's behind this and fueling violence and conflict in many of these countries. But of course, in the end, the only way this will work if we stop the demand. So what's happening right now is ivory is being sold in places, in markets across the US and in Asia. And it's being done for these carvings. It's a cultural perception and attitude. And what we need to do is change the perceptions of people. So we're working in China, using social media, working with celebrities, and working with other people to basically take ivory out of the markets and really try and reduce that demand. And the other thing we did is that we launched a campaign a year ago called 96 Elephants. Why 96? Because we're losing 96 elephants a day. What we've done is to really advocate creating awareness about this, but what we want to do is have a ban on the sale of ivory here in the US and eventually in other countries. And the good news is that a month ago, for the first time, the state of New York and the state of New Jersey introduced a ban on the sale of ivory in these two states. And we're now working with you, many of you here in the room, to make sure that there's a ban on the sale of ivory here in Florida, in California, and in all the states across the US. The other thing that's been very important is that the US Fish and Wildlife Service and the US government has stepped up to the plate and is closing the loops and tightening the regulations for the sale of ivory. There was a ban on regulation on the international export and import of ivory, but the interstate trade of ivory was not well regulated, and there were many places where we could close the loopholes. And I do want to pay a moment, and you'll hear from him in a moment, but to pay tribute to Dan Ash, who's the director of the US Fish and Wildlife Service, who's here with us today for what he and his colleagues have done to tighten this up and to help us with the ivory crisis. Thank you, Dan. The other good news is that many of you have joined us in this campaign. We have reached out to you, and at this point, 116 institutions that are members of ACA have joined the 96 Elephants campaign. Our goal is to get every one of you to help. I really don't care if you have elephants or not. This is a crisis that's happening out there. I should mention, several of the 116 are aquariums. How many aquariums have elephants? Yet you've stepped up and you're helping us deal with this, because if we can reach 180 million people to not only be aware of the crisis, but do something about it, to speak to the legislators, to support conservation groups, to really take these measures, we can win this war. And it is by working with our zoos, by engaging political leaders. This is a picture a year ago at the Clinton Global Initiative with Hillary Clinton, and all those people you see in the front row are African heads of state that call for a ban on the sale of ivory internationally. We need to engage, we need political commitment, we need science, we need conservation, we need education, and we need to pull all of these pieces together to make sure that these magnificent animals, the elephants with whom we share the planet, are going to be around for a long time to come. Now, I've spent a lot of time on elephants, but I don't want you to think it's only about elephants. We need to focus on other groups, like sharks and rays. We're starting to work and designing a campaign like the elephant campaign and strategy, focusing on sharks and rays, that starts with the measures that were taken by CITES and others, and all of the aquariums need to come together, and the zoos need to stand behind them, because 100 million sharks are being killed every year right now for trade in their meat and their fins. And it's not only those, but tigers. And many of us have been working together across zoos, and we are starting to make a difference to make sure that we save those 3,500 tigers that are still left out there. And I could give you a long list of species, but the issue and the main message is that I think we need to work together to make sure that there'll be tigers out there, and that it won't be only in zoos where a child can come to see a tiger. I want to make sure that my children, my grandchildren have an opportunity to go and see a tiger in the wild. I want to make sure they can go and see a shark, and I want to make sure they can see an elephant or a turtle or many of these endangered species. And it is the choice that every one of us is making every day. And I want to ask for your personal commitment and your institution's commitment in standing behind and working together to make sure that the story of Martha, that last passenger pigeon, never comes to happen again, because working together, we can truly change the future of this planet and make sure these animals that we care about are going to be here for generations to come, and we have a thriving planet with wildlife and a healthy planet for people. Thank you very much.